Obviously catching early trains or gone shopping or whatever. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Nigel Edwards as our final speaker of the day. Somebody once said, I think it was me actually, that Nigel has a brain on the NHS the size of Jupiter. And he's our closing speaker, and hopefully will bring some sense of clarity to an increasingly confusing world in terms of what's going to happen to the NHS. And the title of the talk is actually Nigel's own phrase, I believe. What will happen when the NHS is switched on? Will there be any power? Don't forget, all these changes are only 6 months away, so you still have 6 months, hopefully, to prepare for when the power is switched on. Nigel.
Thank you, Martin. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I may be disappointing you because one thing that's become very clear to me over the last few months is that even many of the people who are deeply embedded in this new system are uncertain about how it will work when it's switched on. So Secretary of State, and it's made more complicated by the fact when we talk about the reforms, you need to remember that basically there's the reforms that Andrew Lansley thought he had in his head. There are those that were put in the bill. There are those that David Nicholson are implementing, and then there is what will actually happen. And all of those are different, and not all of them are understood. And now Andrew Lansley's gone, it's becoming extremely clear that his successor doesn't really understand the reform architecture he's been left, and will start behaving very differently from the way that it was actually designed. And Alan was telling me that Ali Parser was off to see the Secretary of State after speaking here. That's a big sign that the current Secretary of State hasn't quite clocked that he's now not running the train set anymore. And I strongly suspect that he's busy developing new levers and mechanisms to get back control of it as we speak. So predicting the future is extremely hard. Was it Niels Bohr who said, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. Actually, it turns out they're quite hard about the present in the current environment. So let's talk about NHS reform. You'll get these slides. I've tried to do NHS reform on a page. It is deeply inadequate. I won't dwell on it. But what it illustrates is one of the reasons Andrew Lansley failed so spectacularly was you were unable to communicate his reforms in anything less than 25 minutes with about 30 PowerPoint slides. Which, given that most political narrative requires you to be able to, you will get these slides. You'll photograph it, you won't be able to read it, but never mind. Yeah. Nice try. I'm not hiding them, but let me try and run through. Okay, Andrew Lansley said this was an evolutionary change. It was pretty radical, and I think that's worth remembering. Although it's kind of in a line with the quasi-market reforms that we saw under the last government, and indeed those who got a sort of genealogy back to the Thatcher reforms of the 90s. This goes further and faster, and it's more radical in its attempt to break the system. And in terms of your understanding of how this new system works, the key question is: did they break it enough to stop it reforming again? Okay, because one thing I'm not very proud of is a quote that was put in the Health Service Journal, and someone came back and asked me, was it mine? Because they said, it's so recognisable, it must be you. And I said, if there was a nuclear war, all that would be left, apart from cockroaches, would be regional offices of the NHS issuing guidance, because they have had this extraordinary ability to, the system recreates itself. It recreates itself because it's in people's heads, deeply embedded, that there is a particular way of behaving. I'll give you an interesting example. Primary care trusts were top-sliced. They had their budgets top-sliced by 1.5–2% very often by strategic health authorities. The strategic health authorities had no legal powers to do that. If a PCT had said, you're not doing it, there's actually nothing the SHA could have done to have made them do it, other than ruin the career of the chief executive, throw out the chairman, and pursue them to where their children went to school. There weren't many other. It was done purely because the oppressor was programmed into the head of the oppressed. It's the ultimate goal of any dictatorial, totalitarian system, is to ensure that the oppressor doesn't even know they're being oppressed. That's great. It's really. It's quite an achievement. And this was part of Lansley's narrative, actually. He wanted to try and sort of break that culture. And the question is, has he done it enough? So, you'll get these slides, but I should actually have done a quick test here. Who feels that they could explain the current NHS reform system to their mother or interested elderly relative? Anyone feel confident about that? I just want to assess your level of knowledge. So on a level of 1 to 10, where 10 is very confident, around about 5, 4, 5, more? Anyone feel more confident than that? More? Do you want to come down here? Yeah? Okay, so there's quite a lot of structural change. You're aware of that. SHAs and PCTs go in April. Okay, so there's a really interesting question about who does strategy in the absence of a strategic authority. And the answer is no one, because Andrew Lansley thought strategy and planning was bad. He had this vision of Ruth Carnell or David Nicholson in a Holodat volcano stroking a cat while border-suited goons gave instructions to shut hospitals. He really did believe there was a highly dictatorial, top-down, Stalinist planning system shutting hospitals. Didn't quite realise, actually, it was almost the opposite. He got in and it became clear that that was the case, and I think like many of his, he had a few sort of dark nights of the soul as his kind of intellectual construct of how the world should work collided with how it does actually work. But both the Lib Dems were against strategic health authorities. You remember the coalition agreement is the basis for these reforms, and Andrew Lansley was against primary care trusts, and everyone's against bureaucracy because that's bad. So those two go. And NHS trusts ceased to be a legal form from what looks like to be 2016. They have to become NHS Foundation trusts or be taken over, broken up, or run by someone else. But they can no longer exist in their current form. So they've got a big mountain to climb because after 7 years, we've still only got half of trusts to Foundation trust status. And that was during a period of growth. So that's quite a challenge. So a whole lot of new machinery. You've seen this diagram like this, yeah? Some interesting new actors. You're increasingly familiar, I'm sure, with clinical commissioning groups. You've heard about the increased role of local authorities in this new system. I think this wasn't one of Andrew Lansley's intentions. This is a bit of an accident of coalition politics. As you may, the sort of long-standing interest of the Liberal Democrats of giving greater power to local authorities in both public health and healthcare planning. There was a strange period, you may remember, where there was going to be a proposal that they would have PCTs, they continue, but they just do public health and they'd be elected until someone did the sums on how much it was going to cost to elect them. And then someone asked the question, well, if they're only doing public health, what does most of that consist of? Well, it consists of things that local government is responsible for, so why are we bothering? So there was this sort of period of 6 weeks where it looked like, actually about 3 days, because if you read the white paper, it became very obvious that the coalition agreement, someone had made a very serious mistake. So by the time they published the white paper, PCTs had gone. They were to be abolished. And we have health and wellbeing boards, and you've heard about them. And I think in their best incarnation, they're a really interesting and potentially quite powerful piece of the new machinery. And while power's been sort of pushed down the system in theory to clinical commissioning groups, in healthcare commissioning, in public health, and a whole number of areas sort of associated with that, including rather bizarrely sexual health services and health visiting. There's been a degree of centralisation with the creation of a central agency in the form of Public Health England. There's a few other sort of little tweets on this which are interesting, and some of them are sort of... Do you remember there was this legislative pause, which was quite an unprecedented thing, actually. No one had ever done that before, in which it was kind of... There was a lot of pushback from particularly... Well, from everyone, really, but particularly from the specialists who felt that Andrew Lansley had almost completely ignored them. He kind of treated... So general practice was the answer. Specialists were just people to be told what to do. And as you may guess, they tend not to be that interested in that as a point of view. So there was a recreation of clinical networks and clinical senates, which are going to give the specialists a voice in decisions about the configuration of services, on commissioning standards and issues of planning. A couple of other things to note. Monitor is quite interesting. I mean, so if you create what is basically a market, which is a much more mixed market with separate payers and providers and more independent providers, social enterprises, for-profit businesses, you've effectively brought the NHS under the remit of competition law. And then the choice is, do you have competition law regulated by the OFT and the European Court of Justice, or do you have a sector-specific regulator? And so Monitor becomes a sector-specific competition regulator, although bizarrely for a while it will also have oversight of the foundation trusts as a sort of private equity owner of the foundation, overseer of the foundation foundation trust. It also sets prices. It doesn't set the pricing architecture. So those of you who got, I was talking to one company the other day who've got a product that doesn't fit, that replaces a surgical procedure, that can be done in hospital, that can be done in general practice, but there's no way of paying for it. The National Commissioning Board set the architecture for that, Monitor do the pricing. They're split up. There's some very clever political science about shared responsibility, arbitration in terms of dispute. It's all very finely balanced. It's beautifully intellectually constructed. Who knows whether it will work, but that's quite an important body. They set the price. Okay? How they set the price is open for debate. Is it just you collect everyone's pricing information and take the average, or do you try and set prices to reflect value? If so, do you set the prices for individual components of a care pathway, or do you try and price the whole care pathway? Do you price on best practice if you can't get at value? You don't have to take the average. So people to watch, both in terms of their competition regulation, but also their price setting approach. The Commissioning Board likewise setting the architecture, those questions about pathways, years of care, best practice, also they have a say in some of those decisions, and from your point of view, potentially quite important, because if they get the pricing of that wrong, you've got a problem, because it looks like there's going to be more enforcement of the way the tariff is used. So the sort of deals that people have been doing to try and create more integration might be harder to unravel. Just one other thing to say, the nation's biggest quango, having gone into government to abolish quangos, and they did abolish quite a few, they've created probably the nation's biggest. It will have a huge amount of the resource. It commissions all primary care services. So the commissioning of the pathway is now quite fragmented. The National Commissioning Board will commission primary care, which is intriguing because most of the commissioning groups are working out that they're going to have to influence the behaviour of their colleagues if they've any chance of succeeding, but they won't hold the contract. So they'll have to find some other incentives to do that. They'll also commission specialist services, the definition of which is being greatly expanded to include vascular surgery and a range of other types of surgery, cancer and some cancer, and a whole load of other things which have traditionally not been in the specialist commissioning bucket. So after 15 years of things being thrown out of specialist commissioning and back to regional specialist commissioners or back to PCTs, there is a centralisation of quite a bit of specialist commissioning. For some of you, that's really quite important because that's where particularly a lot of the high-cost medicines will sit. Okay? Just one other bit of this architecture. I think much more enforcement of NICE decisions by the NHS Commissioning Board down to clinical commissioning groups, and not just NICE technology assessment, but NICE commissioning guidance as well. The government still hasn't quite worked out that just because something has a £30,000 quality adjusted life year return, that it doesn't necessarily make it a cost-effective investment. Everything else you're buying is £8,000 of quality. Yeah? They haven't worked this. This is allocative efficiency. It appears to be beyond them. It's not really. It's just you get on television less for not buying hip replacements than you do for not prescribing highly visible medications to named individuals, which is good news if you're selling those drugs, bad news if you have pain walking. There you go. So what drives this system? Well, choice competition still seen as very important. Government can't get out of the idea of choice is simply choice of provider. And although there's a lot of rhetoric about nothing about me without me, actually no policy to back that up. The government produced a bizarre consultation document on choice, which was all about choice of provider, not about choice of treatment. Meanwhile, the CCGs have started to work out that decision aids for elective surgery and understanding patient preferences is quite, apart from being an ethical thing that you should be doing anyway, actually, but is quite a useful way into controlling variation of referral and treatment threshold. So I expect to see a bit more of that. But the government's vision, lots of choice of competition, create a level playing field, take out the bureaucracy, try and get the GPs off the site, off the benches throwing things at the players and onto the pitch, was Lansley's view. He actually said to me once he was fed up with listening to the GPs whinge, it was time for them to get on and take some responsibility. So I don't know if they quite knew that was the deal when they've gone into this. It's a bit of a deal with the devil, which is, you know, actually, who's going to, if this doesn't work, whose fault is that? I think was his, you know, can I get the politicians to be able to step away, construct a beautiful system that works, you press the button, it all works, I step back from it, if it all goes horribly wrong, I can say, oh, I was nowhere near it. Nothing to do with me, it's these people, it's the GPs. Don't know whether that would ever work, frankly. I think that was kind of politically naive. Anyway, so new home from public health, which we talked about, and in theory a greater focus on outcomes, although the commissioning outcome framework still seems a bit ropey in places. We'll come on to that. And then the government's been given the NCB, National Commissioning Board, which we weren't originally allowed to call it the NCB, because those of you who are old enough to remember the original NCB will remember what Mrs Thatcher did to that. Although I think it's a nice nostalgia, we can all stand around braziers in donkey jackets and say, with NCB written on the back. I think that would be rather fun. Ironically, probably the most Stalinist nationalised industry that there was, run by an the new one, the NCB, being run by an ex-Stalinist, which is kind of interesting. So it was in this pause, and probably the biggest, the really biggest change here to focus on is the, apart from the fact they missed out quite a lot of thinking about education and training, was a renewed focus on integration. One of the big pushbacks was not enough emphasis on the fact that we've only, as Andy was saying to me earlier, we've only got one pot of money, and actually competition and choice of provider and commissioners who just buy single episodes works very badly for chronic disease.